It started as a dare. My friends and I, all 17 and stupid, thought it would be funny to spend Halloween night in the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. You know the type? Worn tombstones leaning at odd angles, trees with gnarled branches that seemed to claw at the moonlit sky, and a history no one could quite confirm, but everyone whispered about. They said it was haunted. I wish I had listened. The air was colder there, even for late October. The place felt heavy, like the ground itself was holding its breath. We brought flashlights, blankets, and a cheap Ouija board because someone thought that would make it more authentic. We laughed at our own nerves as we spread out by the mausoleum, a hulking stone structure that reeked of age and mildew. The others joked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. It began subtly. The wind would pick up, and we'd hear whispers, not from us, but from somewhere in the dark. At first, we wrote it off as nerves. It's just the wind, my friend Sarah said, her voice tight despite the bravado. Then the temperature plummeted, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. We decided to start the Ouija board to distract ourselves. Sarah and I placed our fingers on the planchette while the others sat around us, their flashlights casting eerie shadows. "Is there anyone here with us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling more than she wanted to admit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette moved, slowly, deliberately. It spelled out, "Yes." We froze. "All right, who's doing that?" my friend Jake asked, trying to laugh but failing miserably. No one admitted it. Sarah asked, "What's your name?" The planchette didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, in quick, jerky movements, it spelled S-E-E. "See what?" I whispered, my throat dry. There was no answer, but the whispers returned. This time louder, closer. They weren't just sounds carried by the wind. They were voices, fragmented and low, as if spoken through gritted teeth. And then we saw it. The shadow. It moved between the headstones, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light, but when it turned its head, if you could even call it a head toward us, we knew. This was something else. Jake grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the shadow. It disappeared. "See? It's nothing!" he shouted, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The whispers turned to a low growl, and the mausoleum door behind us creaked open. None of us had touched it. "We should go," I said, already standing, but the others hesitated. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "If we run, it'll chase us." Her voice was barely audible over the rising sound of the wind and the growling. The door to the mausoleum swung wider, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. And then came the smell, rotting flesh, acrid and suffocating. Something stepped out. It was humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its face, or what was left of it, was half decayed, and its hollow eye sockets seemed to bore into us. Its jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and when it moved, its bones cracked, as if they'd forgotten how to fit together. I couldn't move. None of us could. The thing took a step toward us, and that's when Sarah screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever spell we were under, and we ran. I don't remember much about running, just the sheer panic and the sense that the thing was right behind us. I swear I felt its icy breath on my neck, heard its uneven, shuffling steps. We didn't stop until we were outside the cemetery gates, gasping for air. But it wasn't over. When we looked back, the shadow stood at the gate, watching us. Its head tilted, and though it didn't have eyes, I knew it was looking right at me. Then it lifted one decayed arm and pointed. I thought that was the end of it, but the nightmares started the next night. Dreams of the shadow standing at the foot of my bed, whispering my name in that guttural voice. The smell of rot would wake me in the middle of the night, and sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, even though I lived alone. Then things began to happen while I was awake. Objects in my apartment moved. My reflection in the mirror would lag behind, its expression twisted and wrong. One night the whispers started again, louder and more insistent, and I saw it. The shadow was in my room, standing in the corner, its bony hand reaching toward me. I moved out of that apartment, but it didn't help. Wherever I went, it followed. I started noticing strange marks on my arms when I woke up, thin, jagged lines like scratches that burned and bled but never fully healed. I stopped sleeping. I stopped leaving the house. Nothing worked. I finally went back to the cemetery, hoping to, I don't know, apologize? Beg it to leave me alone? The gate was rusted shut, but I climbed over, scraping my hands on the metal. The place was eerily quiet, even more so than before. No wind, no whispers, just silence. I made my way to the mausoleum, my legs trembling with every step. The door was closed, but as I approached, it creaked open. Inside, the darkness seemed alive, swirling and pulsing like it was breathing. I whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over, hoping it would be enough. It wasn't. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of laughter, low and guttural, like a dozen voices laughing at once. When I woke up, I was outside the cemetery gates, covered in dirt and scratches. My friends told me they'd been looking for me all night, but I didn't believe them. I saw the fear in their eyes. They knew something had happened, but they didn't want to know what. I don't think it will ever leave me alone. The scratches still appear. The whispers come and go. And sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I see it standing there, waiting, watching.
Story number 2.
It was late, just after midnight, when I made the mistake of taking that shortcut through the old cemetery. I was driving back from a late shift at work, exhausted and desperate to get home. The road through the cemetery shaved 15 minutes off my drive, and in my tired haze, I convinced myself that the tales about it were just that, stories. I wish I hadn't. The place had always been surrounded by rumors. People said strange lights flickered among the graves at night, and a few swore they heard voices calling their names when no one else was around. But the cemetery was ancient, and ghost stories seemed inevitable in a town like ours. The first sign that something was wrong came when I turned onto the cemetery road. My headlights flickered, just for a moment, and the radio cut out. I glanced at the dashboard, but everything seemed normal. Just a coincidence, I told myself. I was too tired to be spooked. The gravel road crunched beneath my tires as I drove past rows of headstones, their shapes distorted by the shadows of the tall oaks. The night was eerily quiet. No wind, no chirping insects, nothing. My car's engine was the only sound, and even that seemed muted, as if the air was swallowing it. Then I saw her. A woman stood at the side of the road, just ahead. She was wearing a pale, tattered dress that looked like it belonged in another century, and her long, dark hair hung in damp strands over her face. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. She didn't move, didn't look at me, just stood there with her head tilted slightly downward. I rolled down my window a crack. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She didn't answer. Against every instinct screaming at me to drive away, I opened the car door and stepped out, keeping the engine running. The air outside was colder than it should have been, biting through my jacket. "Ma'am?" I called again, but she remained still. I took a step closer, my shoes crunching on the gravel. As I neared, I realized something was wrong. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering, her toes an inch above the earth. Before I could react, her head snapped up. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes nothing but empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, and a sound emerged, a guttural scream that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the gravel. The scream grew louder, more piercing, and the headlights of my car flickered violently. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands fumbled as I threw the car into reverse, the tires skidding on the loose gravel as I tried to get away. The woman, or whatever she was, appeared in the rearview mirror, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She wasn't running but gliding toward the car, her movements unnaturally fast. I slammed the accelerator, the tires screeching as I sped down the winding road. The road seemed longer than I remembered, the trees closing in, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me back. I glanced at the mirror again. She was gone. But the relief was short-lived. A loud thud shook the car, and I felt the weight of something heavy on the roof. The scream came again, this time from above me, so loud it felt like it would split my skull. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, crawling on the roof like some kind of animal. I swerved wildly, trying to shake her off, the car veering dangerously close to the edge of the narrow road. And then she was gone. The weight lifted, the scream cut off abruptly, and I was alone. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, suffocating, like the cemetery itself was holding its breath. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery, the gate disappearing in the rearview mirror. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I drove straight home, locked every door and window, and left all the lights on. Sleep didn't come that night. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak in the house sounded like her scream. The next day I told myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on me. But when I went out to my car, my blood ran cold. Long, deep scratches raked across the roof as if made by claws, and on the windshield, written in what looked like dirt but smelled of decay, was a single word: stay.
Story number 3.
I'll never forget the night I decided to join my friends for a dare, spending 1 hour inside Blackwood Cemetery, the oldest burial ground in our town and the center of countless ghost stories. It was supposed to be harmless fun, just a way to prove we weren't afraid of some old gravestones. If only I'd known what I was walking into. Blackwood Cemetery was infamous for its ominous atmosphere. Even during the day, it felt like a place forgotten by time. The wrought iron gates were rusted, and the gravestones were weathered and broken, some leaning at precarious angles. At night, it became something else entirely, a place that seemed alive, breathing in the darkness. We arrived just before midnight, armed with flashlights and bravado. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Jason, and 3 others from school: Eli, Sarah, and Brooke. We laughed nervously as we pushed open the heavy gates, their creaking sound echoing into the night. "All right, 1 hour," Jason said, glancing at his watch. "Then we're out of here." The cemetery swallowed us whole. The air was colder inside, and the silence was suffocating. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of graves and the occasional gnarled tree. The others wandered off, splitting into pairs to explore. Jason and I stuck together, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "I don't get why people are so scared of this place," Jason said, though his voice was quieter than usual. "It's just a bunch of old graves." I nodded, though the unease in my stomach said otherwise. As we walked, I noticed something strange. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the headstones. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Jason frowned. "See what?" "Nothing," I lied, convincing myself it was just my imagination. We kept walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to shift, dancing just outside the reach of our flashlights. Then we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the grass. Jason stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response. The shuffling grew louder, coming from all around us. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source. The shadows seemed to close in, and then I saw her. A woman stood just a few feet away, partially obscured by a large gravestone. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. She wore a long, tattered dress that fluttered in the breeze, though the air was still. "Hey!" Jason shouted, but she didn't move. I grabbed his arm. "Let's go. Now!" Before he could argue, the woman stepped out from behind the gravestone, and then she vanished. Not into the darkness, not behind another stone. She simply disappeared, like a flame snuffed out. We ran. I don't know where we were going. We just needed to get away. The path seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember, and no matter how far we went, the gate never appeared. The shuffling footsteps returned, louder this time, and then came the whispers. They were faint at first, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But as we ran, they grew clearer. "Get out. Leave. Die." The words hissed in my ears, each one sending a chill down my spine. Jason tripped and fell, his flashlight skidding across the ground. As I helped him up, my beam landed on something I wish I could unsee. The gravestones around us weren't just old. They were freshly disturbed. The earth was churned up, the dirt loose and scattered as if something or someone had clawed their way out. And then I saw them. Hands. Pale, rotting hands emerging from the soil, grasping at the air. Jason screamed as one of the hands latched onto his ankle, pulling him to the ground. I grabbed him, yanking him free with all my strength. The hand writhed and clawed at the empty air before sinking back into the earth. We didn't stop running. The whispers turned into wails, and the shuffling footsteps became a cacophony of movement, like an army of the dead rising behind us. And then we saw it, the gate, standing open like a beacon of salvation. We burst through and didn't stop until we reached the car. The others were already there, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. None of us spoke as we sped away, leaving Blackwood Cemetery behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hands, those eyes, that grin. When I finally dozed off, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My bedroom window had shattered, the cold night air rushing in, and on the floor, amidst the shards of glass, was a clump of dirt.
Story number 4.
It wasn't my idea to visit the cemetery that night, but peer pressure has a way of pulling you into situations you know you should avoid. My cousin Luke, the ringleader of bad ideas, insisted it was just for fun. He had a thing for the paranormal and thought spending the night in the old Ashwood Cemetery was the ultimate thrill. "It's Halloween," he said, grinning as he swung a flashlight. What better way to spend it? I didn't argue, though my gut told me this was a bad idea. Luke, his girlfriend Emma, and I climbed into his beat-up truck and headed out. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades and swallowed by overgrowth. It was the kind of place you only visited if you were dared, or stupid. The air grew colder as we pulled up to the rusted gates. A low mist crept over the ground, curling around the gravestones like fingers. The moon cast an eerie light, making everything look sharper, more menacing. "This place is a nightmare," I muttered as we stepped out of the truck. Luke laughed. "That's the point." Emma wasn't laughing. She clutched Luke's arm, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. I didn't blame her. The cemetery had a heavy, oppressive air, like it was alive and watching us. We walked deeper into the graveyard, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. The gravestones were old, some toppled over, others covered in moss. Names and dates were barely legible, and a few had strange symbols etched into them. "What's that?" Emma whispered, pointing at one of the symbols. Luke shrugged. "Probably just some old religious thing." But I wasn't so sure. The symbol, a circle with jagged lines cutting through it, didn't look like anything I'd ever seen in church. We reached the center of the cemetery, where a massive oak tree loomed, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Beneath it was a crumbling mausoleum, its door slightly ajar. "Let's go inside," Luke said, his voice filled with excitement. "No way," I said immediately. "This is far enough. Don't be a chicken," he grinned, already stepping toward the door. Emma hesitated but followed him. I sighed and went after them, my stomach churning. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay. The walls were lined with niches holding old, dusty urns. A cracked plaque hung on one wall, but the writing was too worn to read. Luke pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is where it gets good," he said. "People say this mausoleum is haunted by the Ashwood Witch. They say she cursed the land before she died, and anyone who disturbs her grave." A loud thud cut him off. It came from behind us, near the entrance. We all froze, the blood draining from our faces. "Probably just the wind," Luke said, though his voice wavered. Another thud, louder this time, and then the sound of shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Luke nodded, but before we could move, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma screamed, and I felt my chest tighten as panic set in. Luke ran to the door and yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he shouted, his voice rising in fear. And then we heard it, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo from the walls. It was a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The laugh grew louder, more sinister, and then a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. One of them stepped forward, taking shape. A tall figure with hollow eyes and a skeletal grin. The figure raised a hand, its bony fingers pointing directly at us. The urns lining the walls shattered one by one, the sound of breaking pottery echoing like gunshots. Ashes filled the air, swirling around us in a suffocating cloud. "Run!" I shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, the mausoleum shrinking, trapping us like rats. Luke dropped his phone and fell to his knees, screaming as something invisible clawed at him, leaving deep gashes on his arms. Emma collapsed, sobbing, her eyes wide with terror as the shadow figure loomed over her. I grabbed a broken piece of stone from the ground and hurled it at the figure. It passed through harmlessly, but the act seemed to distract it for a moment. I ran to the door and threw my weight against it, desperate to escape. Somehow it gave way, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air. "Come on!" I screamed at Luke and Emma. They bolted after me, their faces pale and bloodied. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. Luke fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to start the engine. We sped away, leaving the cemetery and whatever haunted it far behind. The next day, Luke's truck wouldn't start. The mechanic found no reason for it. It was as if the engine had simply died. Emma refused to talk about what happened, and Luke deleted the video from his phone without even watching it. But the worst part, when I got home, I found a small, jagged circle carved into my front door, the same symbol we'd seen in the cemetery. And late that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, that same low, guttural laugh.
Story number 5.
I was always a skeptic, the kind of person who rolled their eyes at ghost stories and dismissed strange noises as just the wind. That was until the night I agreed to help my friend Carrie with a photography project for her college class. She was fascinated by the paranormal and thought Blackthorn Cemetery, the most notorious graveyard in our area, would make the perfect backdrop for her assignment. It was supposed to be simple, a few eerie photos at dusk, and then we'd leave. Nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. Blackthorn Cemetery had been abandoned for decades. Rumors of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and even people vanishing had surrounded the place for as long as I could remember. Carrie dismissed them as urban legends, but as we pulled up to the rusted gates, I could feel something was wrong. The air was heavier, colder, and the setting sun seemed to cast shadows that stretched unnaturally long. "Come on," Carrie said, hoisting her camera bag onto her shoulder. "Don't chicken out on me now." "I'm not chickening out," I lied, stepping hesitantly through the gates. The metal groaned as we pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the silence. The cemetery was a tangled mess of overgrown grass, toppled headstones, and ancient trees with gnarled branches. Carrie started snapping pictures, completely in her element, while I hung back, scanning the area. Something about the place felt off. The wind carried a faint whisper, too low to make out but persistent enough to set my nerves on edge. As Carrie set up her tripod near a large, cracked mausoleum, I noticed a grave nearby that looked freshly dug. I pointed it out to her, but she shrugged it off. "Probably just some maintenance," she said, though her tone wasn't as confident as her words. Then the sun dipped below the horizon and the atmosphere shifted. The cemetery seemed darker than it should have been, like the night was swallowing any light that dared creep in. The whispers grew louder, but they still didn't make sense, just a jumbled murmur that surrounded us. Carrie's camera clicked, and then she froze. "What the?" she muttered, staring at her screen. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping closer. She turned the screen toward me. In the photo she'd just taken, there was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure standing a few feet away from us. But when we looked in that direction, there was nothing there. "It's probably just a trick of the light," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Let's keep going." I wasn't so sure, but I followed her anyway. She moved to a different part of the cemetery, snapping more pictures. Each one showed the same thing, the shadowy figure closer each time. "We need to leave," I said, panic rising in my chest. Carrie hesitated, clearly torn between her fascination and her fear. Before she could respond, we heard it, a loud, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. It came from the direction of the mausoleum. "Run," I whispered, grabbing her arm. But Carrie didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the mausoleum, where the door had creaked open. A figure stepped out, tall and cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly red. It didn't move toward us. It just stood there, watching. I yanked on Carrie's arm, snapping her out of her trance. We bolted toward the gate, our footsteps pounding against the ground. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and deafening, echoing in my head. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel something chasing us, its presence heavy and suffocating. When we reached the gate, it wouldn't budge. The rusted metal seemed fused shut, no matter how hard we pushed. The screams grew louder, and then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, but nothing was there. Carrie pulled out her camera and swung it like a weapon, screaming at whatever was following us. To our shock, the gate suddenly creaked open, and we stumbled out, collapsing on the pavement. The cemetery fell silent behind us, as if nothing had happened. But when we looked at Carrie's camera, every photo she'd taken was gone, replaced with a single image of the glowing-eyed figure standing over an open grave. Neither of us spoke as we drove away, our hands trembling on the wheel. Carrie tried to tell herself it was a glitch, a malfunction, but we both knew better. Whatever we'd encountered in Blackthorn Cemetery wasn't a glitch. It was real. That night I woke to the sound of whispers in my room, faint but unmistakable. And on my nightstand was a single photograph, the shadowy figure from the cemetery staring directly at me.
Story number 6.
I should have known better than to take a shortcut through the cemetery that night, but it was late, and I was in a hurry to get home. Hollowbrook Cemetery wasn't just any graveyard. It was infamous for the stories people whispered about it. Strange disappearances, ghostly figures, and shadowy shapes that seemed to stalk anyone foolish enough to trespass after dark. I told myself those were just urban legends, stories parents told kids to keep them out of trouble. I kept my head down, the the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked along the narrow path. The moon was full, but the overgrown trees blocked most of its light, leaving the cemetery in a shroud of darkness. A cold wind cut through the air, carrying with it the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay. The grave markers were ancient, their inscriptions weathered and unreadable. A few were tilted, some broken entirely. I noticed one in particular, a large stone angel with one wing broken off. Its face seemed to glare at me as I passed, its empty eyes accusing. The first sound came when I was about halfway through. A soft whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped and looked around, my breath visible in the frigid air. There was no one there, just rows of gravestones leaning like weary soldiers under the weight of time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response. The whispering stopped, replaced by an almost deafening silence. I kept walking, quickening my pace. My footsteps seemed louder now, echoing unnaturally. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't just whispering, it was laughter. Low and guttural, like someone trying to stifle it but failing. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was still no one there. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though the words did little to calm me. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My path took me near the center of the cemetery, where the mausoleums were. These were older than the gravestones, their stone doors sealed shut with rusted chains. Most of them were crumbling, the names of the families long forgotten. As I passed one of the larger mausoleums, I felt a sudden chill. A cold so intense it felt like it was cutting straight to my bones. The air seemed heavier, and the shadows around me grew darker, deeper. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. I cursed under my breath, shaking the flashlight as I walked. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing all around me. I froze. It sounded like it was coming from the mausoleum. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned, and for a split second, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer. The figure was gone. I backed away, my flashlight sputtering back to life. That's when I noticed the mausoleum door. The chains that had sealed it shut were broken, the door slightly ajar. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could and never look back. But I couldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to look at that door. Then, slowly, it began to open. A sound came from inside. A low groan like the earth itself was shifting. The darkness within was absolute, swallowing the faint beam of my flashlight. And then it stepped out. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face, God, its face, was a blank, featureless void, save for a wide gaping mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements smooth and unnatural, and it was coming straight for me. I turned and ran, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. The laughter followed me, echoing in the air, growing louder and more maniacal. I could feel it behind me, its presence suffocating, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery, collapsing onto the pavement just beyond the gates. The laughter stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I turned back, half expecting to see it standing there, watching me. But the cemetery was empty, dark and still. I thought I'd escaped it, that it was over. But when I got home, I found something waiting for me on my front porch. A single piece of rusted chain, broken at both ends. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The laughter, low and guttural, coming from just outside my window. I haven't gone back to Hollowbrook Cemetery, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it. The sound of chains rattling and that awful mocking laughter.
Story number 7.
I should have known better than to take the job at the old Willowcrest Cemetery. It wasn't the kind of gig you brag about, but it paid well for a few hours of work each night. My task was simple. Patrol the grounds, make sure no vandals snuck in, and report anything unusual. The place had been neglected for years, the city unable to afford regular upkeep. That's why they hired cheap night guards like me. The first few nights were uneventful. Sure, the place was creepy, with its crumbling headstones and twisted trees, but I convinced myself it was just a quiet patch of land filled with forgotten memories. I'd walk the paths, flashlight in hand, my footsteps the only sound in the stillness. Occasionally I'd hear rustling in the bushes, probably raccoons or stray cats. Then came my 5th night. It started the way it always did, quiet, uneventful. I was halfway through my shift when I noticed something odd, a faint light coming from the far corner of the cemetery. My first thought was vandals, maybe kids with flashlights daring each other to spend the night in the haunted graveyard. I sighed, annoyed, and made my way toward it. The closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't moving like a flashlight beam. It was steady, cold, and flickering faintly like an old lantern. I called out, "Hey, this is private property," but there was no response. When I reached the source of the light, my stomach dropped. It was coming from an open grave. The hole was deep, the earth freshly dug. At the bottom was a lantern, its flame dancing as though caught in a breeze, though the air around me was perfectly still. I shone my flashlight into the pit but saw nothing else. No tools, no signs of anyone who could have dug it. The grave was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I turned, ready to head back and call my supervisor, but stopped dead in my tracks. Standing a few feet away was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was tall, dressed in tattered black clothing that looked centuries old. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, cold, piercing, and impossibly heavy. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward the open grave. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not going down there." It tilted its head, as though curious, and then took a step toward me. That broke whatever spell had paralyzed me. I turned and bolted, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the caretaker's shed. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows around me deepening until it felt like the darkness itself was alive, reaching for me. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, though when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there. By the time I reached the shed, I was gasping for air, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I finally managed to unlock the door and slammed it shut behind me, bolting it for good measure. I stood there in the dark, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I turned. The figure was there, its face pressed against the glass. Its features were wrong, stretched and twisted, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. It smiled, revealing a mouthful of jagged yellow teeth. I screamed, backing away until I hit the far wall. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like claws raking against the glass. Then it stopped. For a moment there was silence. I thought it might be gone. But then I heard a creak, the sound of the door slowly opening. I hadn't just locked it, I'd bolted it. The figure stepped inside, its movements unnaturally smooth, its body barely touching the ground. It pointed at me, its long, bony finger like an accusation, and then at the open grave far outside. The lantern light from the grave began to glow, bright enough to shine through the shed's dirty windows. I felt something pulling at me, a force I couldn't fight. My feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the door. "No," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please, no." The last thing I remember was stepping out into the cold night, the figure leading me back to the grave. I woke up the next morning in my car, parked outside the cemetery gates. My uniform was covered in dirt, my hands raw and blistered. When I went back to the graveyard to explain myself to my supervisor, the open grave was gone. The earth was undisturbed, the lantern nowhere in sight. I quit that day. Sometimes I still dream about the figure, its hollow eyes and jagged smile, and every now and then when I wake up I find dirt under my fingernails.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a quick trip. My cousin Mike and I were heading home after a family gathering, driving down Route 67, a back road notorious for ghost stories and urban legends. We laughed about the tales of phantom hitchhikers and spectral figures that haunted the stretch of highway. It was late, and the road was empty, shrouded in darkness except for the narrow beam of the headlights. As we rounded a curve, Mike hit the brakes hard. Standing in the middle of the road was a woman. She was pale, almost glowing under the headlights, wearing a thin white dress that looked like it belonged in another era. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands over her face, and she wasn't moving. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, gripping the steering wheel. I rolled down my window slightly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I called out. She didn't answer. Slowly she raised her head, and I saw her face. Her eyes were too large, her pupils a void of blackness. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing teeth far too sharp to belong to any human. "Drive," I whispered, my voice shaking. Mike hesitated for a second, then slammed on the gas. The car roared forward, and for a moment I thought we'd hit her. But when we passed where she'd been standing, there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching behind us. We didn't speak for a while. The tension in the car was suffocating, and the faint smell of something rancid filled the air. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. She was sitting in the back seat. Her grin was wider now, impossibly so, and her head tilted unnaturally to one side as if her neck had been broken. She stared directly at me, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Mike," I choked out, "don't look in the mirror. Just drive. Don't stop." "What? What's wrong?" he asked, glancing at the rear view before I could stop him. He screamed, jerking the wheel. The car swerved violently, nearly skidding off the road. She's in the car," he yelled. "Keep driving," I shouted, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman leaned forward, her cold breath on my neck. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice a chilling mixture of laughter and malice. "You're already mine." The car's interior lights began to flicker, and the radio crackled to life, playing a static-filled, eerie melody. Mike floored the gas, pushing the car to its limit. The smell of decay grew stronger, almost overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The car fell silent, the air still heavy with unease. Mike and I looked at each other, neither of us daring to speak. We reached the outskirts of town and pulled into a gas station, needing to catch our breath. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, we checked the back seat. It was empty, but the seat was damp, as though someone had been sitting there. The smell lingered, faint but unmistakable. We didn't go back to Route 67 after that night, and we never told anyone the full story. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone late at night, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. And every time I'm too scared to look back.
Story number 9.
I never believed in ghosts. I thought they were just stories to scare kids or give people something to whisper about on dark, stormy nights. That changed one summer when my friends and I decided to explore the old Dyer Mill. It was one of those places that everyone in town avoided. People claimed it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of workers who had died in a fire decades ago. We laughed it off. It was just an abandoned building, right? The mill was hidden deep in the woods, its crumbling brick walls covered in ivy. The windows were broken, jagged shards of glass framing the darkness inside. The air felt heavier the closer we got, and even the forest seemed quieter. No birds, no insects, just an unsettling silence. "Are we really doing this?" my friend Jamie asked, clutching a flashlight. "Come on," I said, trying to mask my own nerves. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" We stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was damp, thick with the smell of mold and decay. Our flashlights illuminated rusted machinery, piles of debris, and faded posters warning of safety protocols long forgotten. We wandered through the mill, joking nervously to keep the fear at bay. But the deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The shadows seemed to shift and move, and the air grew colder. Then we heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on metal. We froze, our flashlights darting around the room. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where a massive loom stood covered in dust and cobwebs. The loom suddenly creaked as if someone, or something, was pulling at its levers. "Let's get out of here," Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. Before we could move, the loom started spinning. The sound of its wooden frame creaking and groaning filled the room, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that didn't sound remotely human. The air around us turned icy, and a shadowy figure began to form near the machine. It was a man, or what was left of one. His face was charred, his skin blistered and peeling. His hollow eyes burned with a fury that made my blood run cold. He raised a hand, pointing at us with a blackened, skeletal finger. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice like the crackling of flames. We bolted, running blindly through the mill, the shadows closing in around us. The walls seemed to shift, the corridors stretching endlessly. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was there, closer each time. Finally, we burst out of the mill, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods. Only then did I realize we were missing someone. "Where's Sarah?" Jamie cried, looking around frantically. We called her name, our voices echoing in the stillness, but there was no response. Against every instinct, we debated going back, but the sheer terror in each of our eyes kept us rooted where we stood. After what felt like hours, we stumbled back into town and called the police. They searched the mill the next day, but found no trace of Sarah. No footprints, no belongings, nothing. The only thing they did find was the loom. It had been freshly oiled, its mechanisms gleaming as though it had been used recently. We never spoke about what happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a loom spinning, and I swear I can feel someone watching me.
Story number 10.
The night it happened, I didn't think twice about going to the cemetery. It was a dare, one of those stupid things friends do to pass the time on a boring Friday night. Looking back, I wish I had just stayed home. I wish I hadn't gone to that cemetery. It was called Hollow Ridge Cemetery, a small, forgotten patch of land on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place you went for a peaceful walk or to visit loved ones. Hollow Ridge had a reputation. The stories whispered about it were enough to keep most people away. My friend Jake had come up with the idea. He was always the fearless one, or at least he pretended to be. "We'll just go in, snap a few pictures, and leave," he said. "It'll be fun." I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. We arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the orange and pink hues giving way to the deep blue of night. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the usual sounds of nature had been swallowed whole. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken warning. The iron gates groaned as Jake pushed them open. They looked like they hadn't been used in decades, rusted and bent in odd places. Beyond the gates, rows of old, crumbling headstones stretched out before us, their inscriptions faded with time. "This is so cliché," Jake said, laughing as he stepped onto the overgrown path. I followed reluctantly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam of light danced across the stones, revealing names and dates long forgotten. "Over there," Jake said, pointing to a large mausoleum near the center of the cemetery. Its stone walls were cracked, and the once grand doors hung slightly ajar. As we approached, I felt a strange sensation, like the air around me was charged with electricity. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Jake pushed the doors open with a loud creak. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. The walls were lined with niches, some sealed, others disturbingly empty. "Let's get a picture," Jake said, pulling out his phone. As he snapped a photo, something caught my eye. A shadow in the corner of the room. It moved, just slightly, enough to make my stomach twist into knots. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" Jake asked, not even looking up. "There?" In the corner. He shined his flashlight where I was pointing, but there was nothing there. "Relax," he said. "You're just spooking yourself." But I wasn't. I knew I had seen something. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling. Jake sighed, but didn't argue. As we stepped outside, the cemetery felt different, darker, heavier. The path we'd walked moments ago seemed to stretch endlessly before us. "We came from that way, right?" Jake asked, suddenly unsure. "Yeah, I think so." But as we walked, nothing looked familiar. The headstones seemed to shift, rearranging themselves when we weren't looking. "I don't like this," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Calm down," Jake replied. "We'll find the gate." That's when we heard it. A faint whisper, low and guttural. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the night. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his bravado slipping. Before I could respond, the whisper grew louder, turning into a distorted chorus of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their tone was unmistakable, angry, vengeful. "Run!" Jake shouted, and we bolted. But no matter which way we turned, the cemetery wouldn't let us go. The paths twisted and looped back on themselves, leading us deeper into the maze of graves. The whispers grew louder, closer. I could feel them pressing against my skin, cold and suffocating. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. They were translucent, their faces twisted in agony. One reached for me, its skeletal hand passing through my arm. The sensation was unbearable, a bone-deep chill that left me gasping for air. Jake screamed as another figure grabbed him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. I wanted to help, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. "Leave us alone!" I finally managed to shout. The figures paused, their heads tilting in unison. For a moment, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them said, its voice echoing inside my skull. "We're sorry," I pleaded. "We didn't mean any harm?" The figure stared at me for what felt like an eternity before it slowly backed away, disappearing into the shadows. The others followed, melting into the darkness like smoke. Jake and I didn't waste another second. We ran, our hearts pounding, until we finally stumbled upon the gate. It was wide open, inviting us to leave. We didn't stop running until we were back in Jake's car, gasping for breath. Neither of us said a word during the drive home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, heard their whispers. Jake and I never talked about what happened. We avoided Hollow Ridge Cemetery like the plague. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, faint and distant, as if they're calling me back, and I know deep down that the cemetery isn't done with me.